Okay, everybody, we're going to talk about George Washington's second term. Remember, he was super popular. Nobody even wanted to run against this guy. Everybody wanted him to be president. And when he was elected in 1789, that was his first term. And his first term was full of like basically getting the country started, setting precedents. He had gotten a cabinet together and he decided to remain neutral. Remember this with the French Revolution. And even though that was kind of crazy and going over in France, and France was declaring war on England, Washington decided to remain neutral. So when we get to 1792, they talk him into running a second time for president, and of course he wins. Everybody loves George Washington, and so in 1793 he is sworn in as a president for another 4 years, and will be president until 1797. Now, when he's president, the second term, like many presidents, is not really as successful as the first. There's a lot of controversy, a lot of infighting, and so often is the case that a president's second term doesn't always live up to the hype of the first. One of the things George Washington had to deal with is an old issue over taxes. So you remember in American history so far, when people didn't want to pay their taxes, they would rebel. They might, go and smash the windows of the courthouse or whatever. We'd seen that in Boston. We'd seen that with Shays' Rebellion in 1787. Now there's an issue with whiskey and a tax on whiskey. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, and the Federalists in Congress passed a law raising some money by taxing whiskey. So a lot of farmers in Pennsylvania and other places would grow corn as their crop. But one of the problems with growing corn is that oftentimes mice and rats will eat it. Other animals will get into it, like wild animals, like raccoons or whatever. It's really hard to keep it from being eaten by the animals. Also, if it gets wet at all, it can rot. So a lot of farmers decided to turn their corn into whiskey. And it's a process that you can boil it and run it through a still, and you can make it into an alcoholic beverage called corn whiskey. Well, the farmers in Western Pennsylvania were doing that, and this new law would tax this whiskey. And of course, they did not want to pay the tax. So, like many other times, farmers who didn't want to pay just grabbed their pitchforks and their guns and went out in the street and had a little rebellion. So, George Washington has to make a choice here. Does he let this go, or does he decide to enforce the law? And of course, George Washington believes in the Constitution. He helped write it. And so he decides that the government can't just allow this to happen. If we do, they would consider it to be weak. So George Washington gets on a horse, literally gets on a horse, and leads some troops towards Pennsylvania, along with Alexander Hamilton, who will lead the troops the entire way. And they go out and they put down their rebellion. It's not much of a rebellion, really, but the idea of you can just revolt anytime you don't like taxes, George Washington puts an end to that. And so today, even if you don't like a law, well, you could vote for new people to go to Congress to change the law, but you really have to follow it. And if you don't follow it, the president will come for you, or the army, or whoever the president would send. Now, a thing that George Washington was really concerned about was dealing with Native Americans. For him, that was one of the most important issues. And Ohio was really the center of it all. The Native Americans in Ohio, like the Shawnee and the Miami, the Wyandot, the Delaware, Ottawa, others, were teaming up together to resist white men and families moving into their land. Remember, Ohio, under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, was now open for business, and a lot of people were moving to Ohio. Well, the Indians and the Native Americans in Ohio resisted, led by Little Turtle. So it's a big group of Indians resisting. George Washington had sent a few other generals in, but finally his third choice, the third general, is a man named Anthony Wayne. And Anthony Wayne will lead his troops into Ohio, into the northwest corner up by Toledo, and will fight in a battle called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And this battle is a big deal because it really does make sure that the Native Americans are pushed out of Ohio and that it's safe for white settlement. And again, it's the same story of the Native Americans being pushed off their land and moved further and further west. And there'll be some that will stay on reservations, but most Native Americans will be pushed farther west. So the Battle of Fallen Timbers is where that star is, up there on the Maumee River, if you've ever been to the Toledo area. 1794, the natives have lost, and they are forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. So there's a town in Ohio called Greenville, and it's at this spot where the natives come together and they're forced to sign the treaty that Anthony Wayne is there to oversee. So if you can see this map here, it just basically is showing you, this whole area, the whole Ohio area, is now under the control of the United States. It's a territory, Ohio is, but it's well on its way to becoming a state. They'll have 60,000 Americans living in Ohio in 1803, and that's the year that it'll become a state. In 1795, the Treaty of Greenville makes it safe for more Americans to move there. But of course, it's also the beginning of the end for Native Americans in Ohio. Speaking of Native Americans, and especially in the area of Dublin, perhaps you remember the Wyandot, which was on that list we just talked about, led by Little Turtle. But a Wyandot chief in this area is Leatherlips, and I don't know if you've been to that park. You probably have here in Dublin, but he's part of this early time in Ohio, and we'll talk more about Leatherlips in a moment. George Washington also had to deal with several European countries, and probably the most controversial and the thing that really divided the country the most during George Washington's second term is a thing called Jay's Treaty. Now, if you remember, John Jay was actually one of the people who negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1783 that ended the American Revolution and forced the British to give up this territory. Well, it's really weird because now John Jay is the Supreme Court Chief Justice, right? The first Chief Justice. What George Washington does is really odd, and I don't think anybody would do it today, but he asks the Supreme Court Chief Justice to go and negotiate a treaty, which really, the Supreme Court has nothing to do with this. John Jay doesn't work for George Washington. They're separate branches of government. It was basically a big mistake for George Washington to do this, but, we're a brand new country and no one had really thought about it. So John Jay goes back to England and negotiates a treaty. The thing was, the British had really never given us proper respect after the war. They still were picking on us and messing with us. And while they granted us our freedom, they still had army troops kind of in the frontier, up in the Ohio area and on the Great Lakes. And they were doing a lot with our sailors. Like if they would stop an American ship, they would actually take American sailors and force them to be in the British Navy. This is called impressment. And it was a really big deal. It's really going to drive America to the brink of war. A lot of people were angry with the British for this. Obviously, they're kidnapping American sailors. Now, what the British would say was, these sailors, they might have been British sailors who jumped ship. Literally, a lot of British sailors jumped ship because it was so terrible being in the British Navy. They would be beaten and treated poorly. There was never enough food. So people hated it. So a lot of them would jump ship, and some of them would join the American Navy. But when the British stopped a ship, whether we're talking on Lake Erie or out on the ocean, they would force American sailors to be back or join the British Navy. And so impressment really pushed us to the brink of war. And there were a lot of people who did not like. In fact, half the country hated Jay's Treaty because it seemed like we were buddying up with our former enemy and a country that was still bullying us and taking our sailors. But of course, the Federalists like Hamilton and John Jay, they wanted to keep the peace with Britain because Britain was our biggest trading partner. People like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the Democratic Republicans, would say that America was basically cuddling up to a monarch again, and we're heading back to being a British territory. And there's no way we should make a treaty with the British. We should honor our treaty with the French, which we had from the American Revolution. So again, the Democratic Republicans like Jefferson and Madison, they were pro-French and they had wanted nothing to do with Jay's Treaty. Jay's Treaty will really, really divide the country. And there'll be a lot of rioting and fighting, very similar really to today. The second treaty that George Washington negotiates is known as Pinckney's Treaty. Thomas Pinckney negotiates the treaty with Spain. And basically, this one is really not that controversial. Everyone loves it, right? It gives the United States the right to use the Mississippi River and New Orleans. And whoever really can use the Mississippi River out west, that's like the major highway. So cities like Cincinnati will really start to grow because they have the Ohio River, which leads to the Mississippi River, which takes you down to New Orleans and out to the ocean. And so this will really help America grow. It also sets the boundary of Florida with the United States, as you can see in that image on the screen, at the 31st parallel. So that nice straight line there between Florida and the United States, it still kind of exists today over in that panhandle area of Florida. So the Jay's Treaty and Pinckney's Treaty were the two big treaties, and along with the Treaty of Greenville that George Washington was a part of. And again, of course, the Senate has to okay treaties by a vote of 2/3. The Senate have to agree to these treaties, and they were agreed to or ratified by the Senate. But just to be clear, Jay's Treaty did not really deal with the idea of British impressment. They would continue to do it, and it's still going to make America mad, especially the Democratic Republicans in the South are going to believe that Britain is still bullying us and taking advantage of us and treating us like we're still a subject of the British Empire. So by the time we get to 1797, and it's the end of George Washington's time as president, the country is really divided. The Federalists love Britain, right? They want to trade with Britain. They're in the Jay's Treaty. They think that Britain is the way that we get rich and wealthy, and they believe that a strong alliance is needed between the British and the Americans. However, people in the South tend to be the Democratic Republicans. These farmers, they love France. They're all about liberty and the extension of the American Revolution, which they believe is the French Revolution. The problem is, of course, the French Revolution led to war between Britain and France, and so these two nations are at war with each other. And so really the country is divided down the middle. The Federalists are all about Britain, and there'll be riots and demonstrations in the streets, and the French are loved by the Democratic Republicans, and so those people will riot and demonstrate in the streets. So in 1797, the country is really divided between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. I would say similar to what it is today. So our to-do list. Here's what you need to do. There's a Treaty of Greenville video in your folder. It's about 3 minutes. Find a note card. There's one in the classroom where you can write it on your own note card, a 3x5 note card. Take notes of this video, Treaty of Greenville. And on the other side, I want you to dig a little bit deeper about leather lips. He's really popular around Dublin, and there's a reason. So I'll figure out this Dublin connection and maybe put around 10 or so facts about leather lips and the Wyandot tribe in the Dublin area on the other side of that note card. Okay?